Passengers held their breath as the ship grinded against the reef, hoping it would be grounded and they'd be saved. The winds roared in their ears, whipping sea spray upward into their faces like shards of glass. The ship groaned as it lurched, the waves buffeting it and moving it along. Unfortunately for everyone on board, the storm was not yet done with TEV Wahine. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. The Wahine has been a very popular suggestion from you guys for a while now, and we are finally here to do it. Before her date with Destiny, Wahine had a short career. She was designed and built for the Union Steamship Company of New Zealand, and she was one of many ferries that linked the North and South Islands. The first inter-island ferry service was established between Wellington and Picton in 1875, and the first Wellington to Lyttelton service started in 1895 with SS Penguin, owned by the Union Steamship Company. Since this time, it's become a routine to see ro-ro ferries traversing the Cook Strait and the Kaikoura coast. From 1933 onward, the Union Company's Wellington to Lyttelton service was marketed as the Steamer Express. When Wahine was introduced in 1966, two ships were retired. Rangatira, which served from 1930 until 1967 and she was pulled from service in 1965, and Hinemoa, which served from 1945 to 1971 and was pulled from service in 1966. Both ships were sold off in 1967. Though she'd served New Zealand, she was built in Govan, Glasgow, Scotland, by the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company. Plans were drawn up by the Union Company in 1961, and her keel was laid on September 14, 1964 as hull number 830. She was entirely built of steel, and her hull was completed in just 10 months, being launched on July 14, 1965. The same day, she was christened Wahine, which is Maori for woman, the native language of New Zealand. She was actually christened by the wife of the director for the Union Company. The ship's machinery, cargo spaces, and passenger accommodations were installed in the following months, and she was completed in June of 1966. She left Greenock, Scotland to head for New Zealand on June 18, 1966, arriving at Wellington on July 24, 1966. She'd sail on her maiden voyage a week later on August 1st, 1966, but before we really get into her career, let's stop and look at her specs. TEV Wahine was a ROPAX ferry with her tonnage sitting at 8,948 gross registered tons. She was 488 feet long and had a beam of 71 feet wide, spanning 6 decks. She had a maximum capacity of 1,100 passengers on day trips, or 927 berthed passengers on overnight trips, serviced by 126 crew. Wahine was a ro-ro ferry and could carry over 200 cars, driven onto the vehicle deck through her stern doors. Her keel was rusty red, her hull was forest green with one thin yellow pinstripe, and her superstructure was Arctic white. She had one smokestack, painted bright orange with a black tip. Her identification number was 317814. As for propulsion, her power plant was turbo-electric transmission with 4 boilers supplying steam to 2 turbo alternators that drove the twin main propellers, and this allowed her a top speed of 22 knots. She also had stern and bow thruster propellers to propel her sideways for easier berthing. Wahine also had stabilizers that halved the frequency and amount she rolled, something modern ships are still equipped with. Stabilizers are fins or rotors mounted beneath the waterline and emerging laterally from the hull to reduce a ship's roll due to wind or waves. Wahine's hull was divided into 14 watertight compartments by 13 watertight bulkheads. Her lifeboat complement was 8 large fiberglass lifeboats, 2 of which were 26-foot motor lifeboats, each with a capacity of 50 people, 6 of which were 31-foot standard lifeboats, each with a capacity of 99 people, and an additional 36 inflatable life rafts, each with a capacity of 25 people. That gives us a total of 1,594 seats in these lifeboats and rafts. She was set and ready to enter service. And we are set up to continue this episode. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comment section below. Okay, let's get into her brief service history. TEV Wahine entered service with her maiden voyage on August 1st, 1966, with her first sailing from Wellington, replacing Hinemoa. Between August 1st and December 31st, 1966, Wahine made 67 crossings to Littleton. Her and her running mate TEV Maori, which would serve from 1953 to 1972, provided a two-ship regular overnight service between Wellington and Littleton, with one departing from each port each night and crossing during the night. The arrival of Wahine enabled Hinemoa to be withdrawn from service and sold off. Rangatira last sailed on December 14, 1965, and would also be sold off in 1967. During normal crossings, Wahine's crew complement averaged 126, and this breaks down into multiple departments. In the victualling or hospitality department, there were 60 stewards, 7 stewardesses, 5 cooks, and 4 pursers to cater to the needs of the passengers. In the deck department, we have the master or captain, 3 officers, 1 radio operator, and 19 sailors managing the overall operation. In the engine department, we have 8 engineers, 2 electricians, 12 general workers, and 1 donkeyman that supervise the engine operations. A donkeyman was a member of the Merchant Navy who operated a ship's donkey engine, a steam-powered winch that was used for a variety of tasks, such as loading and unloading cargo, raising sails, powering pumps, working winches, and other appliances. It's an odd term, and this is the first time I've come across it. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, on day trips, Wahine carried 1,100 passengers, and on overnight crossings, she carried 927. These 927 were berthed in over 300 single, 2, 3, and 4 berth cabins, as well as 2 dormitory-style cabins, each sleeping 12 passengers. Common areas included a cafeteria, lounge, smoke room, gift shop, 2 enclosed promenades, and open decks. She had 2 vehicle decks with a combined capacity for more than 200 cars. Her career from her entry into service until 1968 was unremarkable, and she dutifully served her route from Wellington to Littleton regularly alongside her running mate TEV Maori. According to modern estimates, the distance between Wellington and Littleton is about 210.5 miles, and would take roughly 11 hours by ferry. The overnight trips were convenient because you would board, go to your cabin, and sleep off the trip, arriving at your destination the following morning after a good night's rest. Long-distance ferries like this went by the wayside in certain areas, including from Wellington to Littleton, after the onset of cheap airfare. However, with acknowledging the hefty environmental impact of these short trips via airplane, many are reconsidering these longer and more sustainable ways of traveling, including by ferry. So don't be surprised if a service like what TEV Wahine was providing comes back one day. We unfortunately know very little about her service history, and so we will be rolling into April 1968 and her tragic loss. If you haven't seen our episode on extratropical cyclone Giselle, I highly recommend watching that first for some context. On the evening of April 9, 1968, TEV Wahine departed from Littleton for a routine overnight crossing to Wellington, with 610 passengers and 123 crew aboard, for a total of 733 aboard. As we know from this week's Fast Facts Friday episode, there was severe weather in the area that made landfall on the North Island on April 9th, and this was Cyclone Giselle. Early in the morning on the 10th, 2 violent storms merged over Wellington, Cyclone Giselle and another extratropical storm washing up from Antarctica, creating a vicious cyclone that devastated the area. At the time, it was the worst storm recorded in New Zealand's history. Cyclone Giselle was working its way south after having caused massive damage and flooding across the North Island. At the same time, a storm working its way up the coast of the South Island from Antarctica struck Wellington. The winds in Wellington were the strongest ever recorded there, hitting 275 kilometers per hour at one point, ripping the roofs off 98 homes in the Kingston neighborhood. 3 ambulances and a truck were blown over onto their sides as they attempted to reach the injured. As the storms hit Wellington Harbor, TEV Wahine was at sea, making her way out of the Cook Strait on the last leg of her journey. There had been numerous storm warnings prior to her departure from Littleton. However, there was no indication that these storms would be any worse than those often experienced by ships crossing the Cook Strait. This area can be quite tumultuous. Generally, this can be a just fine area to cross. However, rough sea conditions or weather are mainly due to a southerly wind that causes wind funneling and tidal flow. These strait conditions can be very difficult to predict, sometimes being choppy and rough. If the wind blows the opposite direction, the tidal currents get churned up, and this can make it much rougher. So rough seas aren't surprising in this area, even nowadays. But as a member, you're never in rough conditions here. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Alright my friends, it's time to get into the accident. At 5:50 a.m., the winds were gusting at 100 to 155 kilometers per hour, and Captain Hector Gordon Robertson decided to enter the harbor. Just 20 short minutes later, the winds increased to 160 kilometers per hour, and Wahine's radar was lost. An enormous wave swept the ship up off her course and in line with Barrett Reef. Robertson struggled with the ship, unable to get her back on course, and instead decided to turn about and head back out to sea. Wahine battled endlessly with the waves and wind for the next 30 minutes, but by 6:10 a.m., she was not responsive to the helm, and her engines stopped responding. At 6:40 a.m., she was washed up onto the southern tip of Barrett Reef, near the harbor entrance less than a mile from the shore. She was sloshed around on the reef, shearing off her starboard propeller and gouging a huge hole in her hull on the starboard side of the stern, beneath the waterline. At this point, thousands of tons of water started to flood in. As for the passengers, they were told the ship was aground, but that there was no immediate danger. They were instructed to put on their life jackets and to report to their muster stations as a routine, quote, precautionary measure. If this was a deliberate stretching of the truth, it's disgusting and can lead to deaths of so many, as we saw with the loss of Costa Concordia, where the situation was deliberately downplayed. Unfortunately, the storm was not done with Wahine just yet, as it worsened and became more intense. The wind picked up to over 250 kilometers per hour, and Wahine dragged her anchors, drifting into the harbor. At about 11 a.m., close to the western shore at Situn, her anchors finally held. Right about this time, the tug Tapuhi reached Wahine and tried to attach a line to her, but after just 10 minutes, the line snapped. Subsequent attempts failed, but the deputy harbor master, Captain Galloway, managed to climb aboard the ship from the pilot boat. The sea was stirred up and foaming with the extreme conditions. Throughout the morning, the danger of the ship sinking seemed to subside as the vessel's location was in an area where the water depth did not exceed 33 feet, and the crew's worst-case scenario was to clean up once the vessel either arrived in Wellington or had grounded in shallower water. There were even thoughts that the ship would sail again that evening as per usual, though later than scheduled because of the damage done by the reef that needed repaired. These positive vibes would be dashed sooner rather than later. Around 1:15 p.m., the combined effect of the storm and the tides swung Wahine around, providing a patch of clear water sheltered from the wind. Suddenly, she started to list further and further starboard, reaching a point of no return. Robertson then gave the order to abandon ship. Similar to what happened with the sinking of SS Andrea Doria, the listing got so bad that 4 lifeboats on the port side of Wahine were utterly useless. We also saw this with the loss of RMS Lusitania, and in multiple incidences with listing ships. Only the 4 lifeboats on the starboard side could be launched, and the first one, the starboard motor lifeboat S1, capsized shortly after being launched. Those on this boat were thrown overboard, and many were drowned in the rough sea, including 2 children and several elderly passengers. Survivor Shirley Hick, distinctly remembered for the tragic loss of her 3 children in the disaster, recalled this capsizing vividly, as her 3-year-old daughter Alma drowned in this lifeboat. Some managed to hold onto the overturned boat as it drifted across the harbor to the eastern shore, towards Eastbourne. The 3 remaining lifeboats, which according to numerous survivors were severely overcrowded, but they did reach shore. Lifeboat S2 reached Situn Beach on the western side of the channel with about 70 passengers and crew, as did Lifeboat S4, which was overcrowded with well over 100 people. Heavily crowded Lifeboat S3 landed on the beach near Eastbourne, about 3 miles away on the opposite side of the channel. Wahine did launch her life rafts, however waves up to 20 feet high capsized some of them and many people were killed by this. She sank in 38 feet of water, resting on the bottom mostly upright. This forced hundreds of passengers and crew into the rough sea. When the weather cleared up, the sight of Wahine foundering in the harbor led many vessels to race to the scene, including the ferry GMV Aramoana, tugs, fishing boats, small personal craft, and yachts. They rescued hundreds of people. Over 200 passengers and crew reached the rocky shore of the east side of the channel, south of Eastbourne. As this area was unpopulated and desolate, many survivors were at the whim of the elements for several hours, awaiting rescue teams that were desperately trying to navigate the gravel road along the shoreline. It was here that a number of bodies were recovered as well. At 2:30 a.m., the Wahine rolled completely onto her starboard side, exposing the port side to the sky. Some survived the wreck only to make it to the shore and die of exposure or exhaustion. 51 died at the time, and 2 more died later on from their injuries, leaving a death toll of 53 in total. Most of the victims were middle-aged or elderly, but the toll included Shirley Hicks' 3 children. Victims died from drowning, exposure, or injuries from being battered on the rocks. 46 bodies were recovered in total. 566 passengers were rescued and 110 crew were rescued, with 6 missing. Rest in peace to all those lost in the sinking of Wahine, particularly those 3 dear innocent children. May they rest easy. 10 weeks after the disaster, a court of inquiry found errors of judgment had been made. However, they stressed that the conditions at the time were difficult and dangerous. Due to the free surface effect on the car deck, Wahine capsized thanks to a buildup of water on the vehicle deck. We do have to note that several specialist advisors to the inquiry believed that she had grounded a second time, taking on more water below decks. Although the order to abandon ship was given at the perfect time. The report of inquiry states that more lives would almost certainly have been lost had the order to abandon ship been given earlier or later. The storm was so strong that rescue craft could not have helped any earlier than right around midday. Though charges were brought against Wahine's officers, they were all acquitted. Early hopes that the ship could be raised and repaired were dashed once the magnitude of structural damage had been ascertained. As the wreck was a navigational hazard, preparations were made over the next year to refloat her and tow her into the Cook Strait for scuttling. However, a similar storm in 1969 broke up the wreck, and it was dismantled where it lay. It took more than a year for the Union Company to order a new ferry to replace Wahine. In May of 1969, they ordered TEV Rangatira, built by a different British shipyard and to a new design. She had accommodation for 159 fewer passengers, and like Wahine, could carry more than 200 cars. Rangatira entered service in March of 1972, almost 4 years after the loss of Wahine. She was a commercial failure, carrying on average only just over half the number of passengers and a third of the vehicles for which she had capacity. From 1974, the New Zealand Ministry of Transport subsidized the steamer express, but in 1976 it withdrew the subsidy and the service ceased. Cheap airfare was the main cause of the collapse of the steamer express. Wahine Memorial Park marks the disaster with a bow thruster near where the survivors reached the shore at Seatoun. J.G. Churchill Park in Seatoun has a memorial plaque, the ship's anchor and chain, and replica ventilators. A plaque and the foremast are at the parking area near Burden's Gate on the eastern side of the harbor, on the coast where many of the survivors and dead washed up. The main mast forms another memorial in Frank Kitts Park in central Wellington. The Wellington Museum has a permanent commemorative exhibition on its maritime floor that includes artifacts and a film about the storm and sinking. The loss of the Wahine was an utter tragedy, and it goes to show how all of us are at the mercy of Mother Nature, with little to no control over our surroundings. Rest in peace to the victims of this horrific tragedy, and may we never forget. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our cruise ships, ferries, and robo-ferries playlist in the cards. Tune in next week for the story of Kaga, an Imperial Japanese aircraft carrier sunk at the Battle of Midway. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.